book of Isaiah. I don't know maybe fully why. Having been a pastor for many years, I have some thoughts as to possibly why. But it's just like when I approach that, the light goes out. You know, it's a good book. I don't cast any reflection on the good prophet. But when I go to it to try to get into it, to prepare it, the fire just goes out. So I feel like from that the Lord, for the time being, has just taken that away from me and directed my mind elsewhere. And I've learned over the years to follow that. That if the Lord takes it away, don't try to force it, because He's got a reason for what He's doing. That He knows the needs of the people better than I know. And I find that my preaching is much more effectual and powerful and sweet when I follow those leads that I have. But it's like when I go to it and try to study, the fire doesn't burn. It's something that I have to force. Whereas what I want to talk about tonight, it's different. The fire burns. When I went to this conference this Saturday, I was listening to the ministers talking about the subject of the eternal security of the believer. One of the important aspects of the scheme of eternal salvation. And particularly the last minister, he wasn't really telling me a lot of things that I didn't know already. But I sat there and I just enjoyed hearing about it so much. And I thought, I'm an elder, and I ought to know more about this book than you know. I mean, for all the hours that I've spent in it, over and above what you have spent in it. It's my job to be well informed. And if hearing that gospel story brings such joy to me, I'm sure it would to you as well. Even if it's hearing something you've heard before. Obviously, hearing the story again and again brings joy to the Lord's people, as is reflected, for example, in an old song they used to sing in my wife's home church, "Repeat the sweet story of Jesus to me." And what I want to talk, and yet, even though I may take up a subject that I've done many times before, when I go back to it and I think about it, there's always some extra little angle, some little something I haven't thought of before, maybe big something, that it's as though it's an inexhaustible store of truth. But what I want to do is talk about the first aspect of what have been called the 5 points of grace. I'm sure you've all, now maybe you haven't, but some of you are familiar with what has been called the T.U.L.I.P. Now that's just a phrase that's been coined to help people remember 5 points of what we call the doctrine of salvation by God's grace alone, apart from human effort, that God does all the saving. This was drawn up by a man named John Calvin. Calvin did not originate it. Calvin discovered it. It was in the Bible already. God's the originator of this scheme of doctrine, and Calvin just systematized it and discovered it and systematized it, made it convenient for us. But what the T.U.L.I.P. is T, total depravity. U, unconditional election, that God has chosen whom He will save, and that's not conditioned on their performance. L, limited atonement, that Jesus did not die for everybody. He died only for the elect. I, irresistible grace. That is, when God gets ready to save you, when He gets ready to give you a new heart, to change your nature, to bring about the new birth, that it's an irresistible operation. It is not a matter of God saying, okay, I'll do this if you let me. God does it without consulting your will. And then lastly, the preservation, P, the preservation of the saved. That once God saves you, that salvation can never be undone. That's what's called the T.U.L.I.P. And I want to talk tonight about the T, the total depravity. Now, this lays the groundwork for understanding salvation by grace. Now, one of the things I want to bring out in the introduction of my comments tonight, a couple of verses, one from Acts chapter 20 and verse 24, as the Apostle Paul was talking about what his ministry was all about. Acts chapter 20 and verse 24. But none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy and the ministry which I have received of the Lord Jesus, to testify the gospel, the good news of the grace of God. Now that's what God called the Apostle Paul to tell about, was the good news of the grace of God. And that was his primary ministry, his primary witness. And that's the message that God blessed and made very effectual in the ministry of Paul, so that we saw the world being turned upside down by this testimony of the grace of God. Now, that was Paul's ministry. That's my ministry, because Paul is my pattern. Turn that off a minute. We'll let them get seated. So we're picking up and where we turned off there, the tape, that I want to talk tonight about total depravity, which is fundamental to understanding the grace of God. And I was talking from Acts chapter 20 and verse 24, that the Apostle Paul said the ministry that he received of the Lord Jesus was to testify the gospel of the grace of God. And he is my pattern. So I have a ministry to testify to you and to others the grace of God. But as far as your personal witness is concerned, it also is a testimony of the grace of God. Turn to Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. Colossians 4 and verse 6. And my reason for going to these verses is to, as an introduction, to emphasize the importance of our being well grounded in the principles and the teaching of the grace of God. For myself as a minister, that's a primary testimony of my ministry, and for you in your witness to others. Because of all things, that's the thing we most and foremost want to see people converted to, is the doctrine of the grace of God. Because if you don't get converted to that, then every other aspect of your religion is going to be warped, as far as what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you intend to accomplish by it. That in serving God, it is not only important that we have the correct procedure for our service, but it is also important that we have the right reason for doing what we do. And that's going to get all messed up if a person does not have a clear understanding of the grace of God. You go out and look at these churches here in the world, and a lot of the reason they are the way they are is their lack of understanding of the grace of God. So this is essential in understanding for a true conversion and a correct ordering of the affairs and conduct of our religion. So in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6, and this is talking to you as church members, men, women, and children. Paul addresses all three in the Colossian epistle. He said, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man. So you need to have your mouth equipped with the ability to tell people about the grace of God if you're going to be effective witnesses to people. So that's what makes a study such as I'm engaged in tonight so very important, to keep constantly in our thoughts and in our conversation the grace of God. That's got to mix and mingle with the whole thing. So that renders it very important. So let's first of all just look at Ephesians chapter 2, 8 and 9 and define a couple of terms that are very important in presenting to people the grace of God. And then we'll work from there into total depravity. Because this aspect of total depravity is absolutely fundamental to understanding the grace of God. Total depravity explains why salvation is by grace. That lays the groundwork as to why it has to be by grace. In Ephesians chapter 2, this familiar verse, and verse 8, "For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." Two terms that are important to define in that verse are the terms grace and work. They're put obviously in contrast to each other. You're saved by grace, not of works. Now, grace is defined as favor. If I do you a favor, that by definition is grace. It's favorable regard or its manifestation, now only on the part of a superior. It's favor or goodwill. Favor or goodwill in contradistinction. That means in contrast to right or obligation as the ground of a concession. You see, if I do something for you simply because I want to, not because I'm obligated to, not because I owe it to you, not because I have to, but simply because I want to, that's grace. If I do it to you because you have obligated me to do it, or if I am doing it for you as something in return for what you did for me, then that's not grace. If it's grace, then there's no obligation or right. You don't have a right to it. You can't demand it of me. I'm not obligated to do it for you. I do it just simply because I want to. So when we talk about salvation being by grace, by definition, that cuts out the idea that God saves you because you did something for God that obligated God to do that. Grace cuts that concept out altogether. Now, when he says it is not of works, work by definition is something that is or was done. It's what a person does or did. Anything that you can do or that you do is by definition a work. I don't care what it is. If it's believing, and believing is something you do. And we can prove that very easily. Remember the Philippian jailer asked the Apostle Paul. He said, "What shall we do?" Paul said, "Believe." So believe is something you do, and that by definition is a work. Now we're told here we're saved by grace, not works. So the very definition of the terms exclude the notion that God saves you in response to something you did for God or unto God. And the reason that salvation must be this way, the reason it must be by grace and not of works, is you don't have any works that count for anything anyway because of your total depravity. Now let's understand specifically what we mean, and this is important, what we mean by total depravity. We mean by that man's entire being, everything about him, is infected by sin. His body is infected. His soul, his spirit, his thoughts, his imaginations, his desires, his emotions, his intents, his resolve. Everything that goes to make up what we call the human person is infected by sin. That's what we mean by total depravity. We do not mean that every sinner has done every bad thing that a person could do. There are many people that are totally depraved that never killed anybody and never will. Maybe never stole from anybody and never will. We do not mean by total depravity that you have done every evil thing that you could do. However, we do mean by total depravity that you have the potential, that there is no sin committed on the face of this universe, no violation possible of the law of God, but that you could do it. You have the potential for any sin, whether you ever did it or not. That's what we mean by total depravity. And when we talk about total depravity, we mean that any good that you do happen to do is polluted by sin, so that it is in reality no good at all. I mean, totally depraved, rotten, hell-bound sinners do, quote, good things. I mean, there are people that will spend eternity in hell that paid their debts, that did not kill other people, that loved their wives or loved their husbands, as the case may be, were good parents or brought up their children and taught them certain things that were right, and maybe went to church on Sunday or even got baptized. There are people that have done things like that that will spend eternity in hell. The reason being is that good that they were doing was infected by sin and was not done for the right reasons. A person might love his spouse out of a natural affection for her as a woman with no regard to God. Not doing it because God said to do it. Not doing it because he loves righteousness and wants to do the right thing, but just because he happens to love that woman and he doesn't love any other, and so he may be faithful to her out of that, but it goes no further than himself and something within himself and his own self-interest. Or Jesus, for example, pointed out, notice the scribes and Pharisees. He gives an example of them in Matthew chapter 6. He says, when you do your alms, that is talking about the money you give to the poor. He said, don't do it like the hypocrites. For they do what they do to be seen of men. They get out and they make an announcement in public about the fact that they're about to give. Or when they pray on the street corner so everybody can hear them. Or when they fast, they make sure to make themselves look sad, and so everybody looks at them and says that person is fasting. But in this, even though what they're doing, if you look at it on the surface, they're doing something that would be good. I mean, they're giving to the poor. That's something God said to do. They're praying, they're fasting, but they're doing it out of a selfish interest with no interest in God. You understand that? So you got to be very careful to understand what we mean by total depravity, is that even the good they do is infected with sin. Like Jesus said to the Pharisees in Matthew 23:5. He said, their works they do for to be seen of men. So we're talking about the fact that any good they might do, that is, as far as some outward conformity to a commandment of God, is itself polluted with sin. And this is an important point to realize, because in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 13, Paul makes an interesting statement. He says, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse. Now, if you ever run into somebody that's astute, that does not believe in total depravity, they are very likely to take you to that verse and posit this argument. And that's what's making what I'm talking about now important. What would you do if some Church of Christ debater who does not believe in total depravity came up to you and said that 2 Timothy 3:13 says evil men shall wax worse and worse, and he would say, how could they wax worse and worse if they are totally depraved? Think about that for a moment. How would you answer that question? If they are totally depraved, and if you want to get some coffee or something, some of you having a rough time here, please get some. Get you some proper coffee or something. But if a person is totally depraved, how can he wax worse and worse?
He hasn't carried out all of the potential evil that he could do.
Precisely. Qualitatively, he's as bad as he could be. Quantitatively, he could do more. Okay? One murder... I mean, if you commit one murder or 7 murders, qualitatively, you are a murderer. You couldn't be any more a murderer if you committed 7 murders. I mean, committing 7 murders doesn't make you more of a murderer than if you commit 1. I mean, once you commit a murder, you are a murderer, and there's no way you can become more of a murderer than you already are. You can commit more murders, but you were a murderer the minute you committed a murder. Do you understand that? So the way they wax worse and worse is not qualitatively. They're just as much sinners. I mean, once you're a sinner, you're a sinner. But quantitatively, Dave answered the question correctly, in that they can add more and more sins to the record. But the nature that caused them to commit those sins was just as bad when it committed 1 as it was when it committed 7. Do you understand that? That's very important. So what we mean by total depravity is the entire being is affected with sin and capable of any sin, though it may not have committed every sin that could be committed. Now we understand why people are in this rotten shape. And that is because of the transgression of Adam. In Romans chapter 5, verse 12, very important verse. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. The sin got here by one man, and it's affected the whole race as a result. We all know who that one man was. That God told Adam, in the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die, speaking of the forbidden fruit. And when he did that, not only did he become infected with sin, but he passes that infection on to his posterity because he was acting as our representative, acting for us, so that whatever he did, we would feel the consequences of his action. And then verse 18 and 19. As by the offense of one, judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so by the righteousness of one, the free gift came upon all men to justification of life. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. So his disobedience made us sinners. That's how we got in that shape. And as a result of that, the whole human race is infected with sin from their conception. And before I go any further, you want to go turn your air? It's starting to get real stuffy in here. You want to go fix that? Where David said, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. So, I mean, right from the moment of conception, he was infected with sin. Passed on to him from his father Adam. And then in Psalm 58 and verse 3, the wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they be born, speaking lies. And every parent understands that you do not have to teach children to do wrong. They are born with a tendency to do wrong. You have to teach them. You have to restrain that tendency with instruction and with the rod. Why is it that way? Why is it that they're born doing wrong, born knowing how to do wrong, having to be restrained by discipline and instruction? Why is that? Because they were infected from their conception, born in that condition, and that owing to our father Adam, that the Lord told him. And he was representing all of us, so that when he fell down into that condition, we all fell in him. By his disobedience, we were made sinners. Our disobedience didn't make us sinners. His did. We do not sin in order to become sinners. We sin because we are infected from our birth. Adam has just passed that down. See, this is why, in order to produce a sinless human being, notice what God did. He bypassed the daddy. You notice that? Because you see, sin comes by man. So God bypassed the generative act of the Father, produced out of Mary the Christ child, and he was sinless because he didn't have a human father. See, it's transmitted. Boys, we're responsible. We did it. And we pass it to our offspring. So God circumvented that in the virgin birth to produce the only sinless human being that ever lived in the world, and that was the Lord Jesus Christ. Now let's look at the biblical description of man's depravity. The first one I want to take you to is Genesis chapter 8. We want to see just how rotten man is as a result of sin. And this is why salvation must be by grace. And if people cannot... If once you grasp this fact, then everything else falls in place. You have to have election. You have to have God doing it. Once it becomes evident man can't, there's no other way. This is fundamental. If you're going to have the grace of God in your mouth so that you know how to answer people, because this is what we want to convert people to. Listen, I want them to get baptized. But in order to that, let's get them to understand grace. They need to understand grace. Because I don't want them being baptized thinking their baptism is what's saving them. Because that'll mess it up. You see, again, your reason for doing what you're doing has everything to do with whether it's acceptable or not. If when you obey God, your obedience to God is with the idea that I got to do this so that God will save me, then you're doing it for the wrong reason, and it doesn't honor God. In fact, it dishonors God, because it's like saying what God did was not enough, I've got to do something. It insults His grace. And therefore it's rotten. See, there's a part of your total depravity. There's a lot of people out here that go through the motions of religion, and in some cases correct motions of religion, but they're doing it with the idea that this is what is necessary to get God to save me, and thus their good is polluted. Thus a further evidence of their depravity. That's what we mean by total depravity. Man is so rotten that even when he does good, is good polluted with sin, so that it is in reality no good at all. This is what the prophet meant when he said our righteousnesses. I mean, those things that we do, that you could find a commandment that says do it and we're doing it. And even that's filthy rags, polluted by sin, without the grace of God. So this is very important to understand grace. And so we come in looking at the biblical description of man's condition, and we read in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 21. And the Lord smelled a sweet savour. Now, what you have is this. What we're reading about here is what happened immediately after the flood of Noah, when the human race had gotten so rotten that God just wiped it out in a flood. Now, you would think that a punishment that drastic, that if anything was going to shape people up to be better, it would be that, wouldn't it? I mean, a flood to wipe out the human race with only 8 people left. You'd think if something was really going to get people's attention and make them clean up their act, it would be that. Well, let's see how much effect that had on changing man's nature. Genesis chapter 8:21, the Lord smelled a sweet savour. And the Lord said in His heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart. See, the things he conceives in his thoughts, his heart, is, is, not was, but is evil from his youth. Now, you know, some people might point out that little word is there is in italics, that was inserted by the translators and was not in the original Hebrew. Well, having studied Russian, that doesn't bother me, because Russians, when they speak in the present tense, using the verb to be, they don't use it. You do not say in Russian, I am a preacher. You say, I preacher. You wife. That baby. That wife. This Bible. So, what? I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart evil. From his youth. It comes out the same whether the is in there or not. Just in English we use the is. So the translator stuck it in. God's talking to us in English, so He accommodates our tongue and inserts that. Neither will I again smite everything living as I have done. Look at that. The imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. So there we are, I mean, from birth, from youth, we are wicked. I mean, it just didn't. The flood didn't change that at all with respect to human nature. Then turn back to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5, and you find that after the flood, man's in the same shape as he was before the flood. In Genesis 6:5, this is a description of man's depravity. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's about as clear a statement of total depravity as you could want. I mean, look at every imagination is only evil all the time. I mean, there's no good in there. That is total depravity. Even his religious thoughts are polluted with that evil, and thus themselves are evil. And then, of course, we come to Romans 3. And there's a real important lesson for us to get in Romans 3 that people have not learned and never will learn, I don't guess, on the face of this earth, as far as the masses of mankind. Some people understand it and know it, but the masses don't, never have, probably never will. Sure, they never will. Romans chapter 3 and verse 9, Paul said, now this is interesting. In verse 8, Paul has quoted some slander that's been thrown against him. There were people that were slanderously reporting that the Apostle Paul was teaching that we ought to do evil so good may come. And he was teaching no such thing. That was a piece of slander. So Paul says in verse 9, writing to the Roman Christians, he said, what then? Are we better than they? Are we better than those who slander us? Think of the worst enemy you've got on the face of this earth. And I ask you tonight, are you better than that enemy? Are you a better person than the worst enemy you've got? Paul answered, no, in no wise. Because apart from the grace of God, you're just as rotten as He is, and there isn't anything He did you wouldn't do. And until we are visited by the grace of God, the only treasure we've got in our heart is evil. There's no good in there to be brought out. To further demonstrate man's inability, turn to Proverbs 15, that he can't do anything to recover himself. In Proverbs, to change his nature, Proverbs 15:8, the sacrifice of the wicked is abomination to the Lord. So there's nothing he can bring to God and give to God that will please God. Verse 9, the way of the wicked is abomination to the Lord. Any way he goes, whether it's going into a bar room or going down the aisle of a church, subtract the saving grace of God from it, and it's abomination. And then in verse 26, the thoughts of the wicked are abomination. There's nothing he can think, there's nowhere he can go, and there's nothing that he can give that will please God. He cannot please God. He does not have that capacity. And what is furthermore, doesn't even have that desire. See, somebody will counter this and say, you mean if I really wanted to please God, you're telling me that if God doesn't save me, I can't do it? Well, let me tell you something. If you really from your heart want to please God, you've already been saved. That's why you do. That's why you do. Something's happened, and that's why you want to please from your heart. I'm not talking about a show to be seen of men. I mean a real desire in your heart to do what pleases the Almighty, regardless of what men think. That comes from God. We're talking about people that don't have that. That nothing they think, do, or give is anything more than an abomination. That just demonstrates why we read and demonstrates his helplessness. We read in Psalm chapter 39 and verse 5, Psalm 39:5, behold, thou hast made my days as an handbreadth, and mine age is as nothing before thee. Verily every man at his best state is altogether what? Vanity. Nothing. I mean, you doing the best you can do amounts to nothing. And then I love Isaiah 64:6. All our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. We're all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. So that's how helpless we are. Our condition is described in Romans chapter 5 and verse 6 as being without strength. That's the condition of man in sin. He is without strength. He's not without strength to sin. Oh, he's got plenty of energy for that. I mean, he's got a volition, a will, a drive, a want to, a dynamic, an energy. He's got that for sin. But when it comes to genuine righteousness from the heart to God, nothing. No strength. And then, in fact, he's so helpless that his condition is described in Ephesians 2:1 as being dead. You hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins. Dead. How much can a dead man do? How much can a dead man effect? How much can a dead man want to do? See, when we talk about man being unable to recover himself, you must understand that man's inability, I'm about to finish, is shot through with an unwillingness. He cannot do what is furthermore he does not want to. Jesus said to the Jews one time, and this is something people will throw at you. He said to the Jews in John chapter 6, I believe it was verse 40, he said, you will not come to me that you might have life. You'll have people that will take that verse and say, well, see, that proves right there that man can come if he wants to. Because it says, you will not come to me that you might have life. Well, that proves that you can come. No, it does not. You tell me, how does a verse that say you will not proves you will? Jesus said you will not. That doesn't prove you can. It proves you won't. That's what that proves. Isn't that funny? Take a verse that says they won't do something and use that as proof that they will, or that they can. He said you will not. They are unwilling. Well, then that brings us to Mark chapter 10. I realize that this is not very good news. But I'm going to tell you something. Until you understand this, you won't appreciate what is the good news. The good news is God saves sinners. And I mean that God saves sinners. That's the news. It's not that God makes salvation possible or makes salvation available. It is that God does it. That's the news. The news is not a proposition. The news is a declaration. But until you understand this, that news is not good news to you. When you understand that man cannot save himself, then it's good news to hear God did what he couldn't do. And that brings me to my closing verse in Mark 10, 26 and 27. They were astonished out of measure, saying among themselves, who then can be saved? And Jesus, looking upon them, saith, with men it is impossible, but not with God. For with God all things are possible. So if you and I are going to give testimony to the Word of grace as we have been taught, you see, that's what the book of Romans is about. The book of Romans is a systematic declaration of the gospel. And it begins with setting forth and proving that all are under sin. You've got to see that first. And when you see that and the implications of that, then it is easy to understand that if man is saved, it's got to be God doing it. Once you see man is incapable. That's very, very fundamental and necessary, and a vital part of understanding grace. May the Lord bless the word of His grace to your hearts and to His glory. Thank you for your attention. Okay, now for our prayer time tonight.